Hello, my name is Paula Simons. I'm the city columnist with the Edmonton Journal, and I'm here today in the Edmonton Journal's newsroom studios with my colleagues Jonny Wakefield.
Hello.
And Graney.
Hi.
Jonny and Juris are members of our crime bureau, and together with our colleague Paige Parsons, we've prepared a series of stories and columns looking into the consequences of the Campbell Report. Now, the Campbell Report, which came out last month, examined the circumstances by which a young Indigenous woman who was the victim and prime witness in a sexual assault trial was treated more like the accused. When the judge and the Crown Counsel became concerned that she might not appear to continue her testimony, they actually had her remanded and held in the remand center for 5 days. She was transported back and forth between remand and the courthouse in handcuffs and shackles. The Campbell Report was commissioned by Alberta Justice to try to look into some of the systemic reasons that this woman, whose name is subject to a publication ban, was treated in this really reprehensible way. And we've spent the last couple of weeks unpacking the consequences of the Campbell Report and what it might mean. So I'm going to start, Juris, by asking you about the issue that shocked a lot of people, the fact that although this woman was the victim and the witness, she was transported back and forth to the courthouse in shackles. What is the province's policy about shackling people in general?
So the people that I spoke with, I mean, they were pains to point out that this was like an unprecedented event in terms of shackling of the victim here. So the policy for the sheriffs and the remand centre is that physical restraints are only to be used when necessary. But the Campbell Report kind of points out, using comments from the sheriffs that she spoke with, that shackling of incarcerated witnesses was common in Edmonton, and that was kind of shocking for her. And she also wrote that the sheriffs indicated that this policy may not be followed in terms of looking at each individual case.
So the question isn't just shackling a woman who had committed no crime and posed no threat, but the fact that they're shackling prisoners as the default setting, even in the cases of nonviolent prisoners.
Yeah, basically. So when I spoke with Deputy Chief of Court Security and Prisoner Transport, Darryl Gourley, I put Campbell's assessment to him, and I said, is this a fair assessment? And it took him a little while, but he agreed that default setting was shackle. So that's why they've gone back to their policy books, and they wanted to make sure that there was some kind of clarity there when it comes to individual cases. Campbell made no specific recommendations to the practice of shackling, but she did basically say to sheriffs and remand, hey, look at what your policies are, review them, and then make the changes that are appropriate. And so where to next, I guess, is the Alberta sheriffs are they're using the provincial courts in Lethbridge and Medicine Hat, and they're going to be using those as testing grounds for new practices of shackling and restraining people in custody. And
now, of course, I mean, it would be a nice consequence of this tragic case if we got a better policy for the treatment of prisoners. Mm-hmm. But the woman in this case was at no point accused of any crime. So what did the sheriff say about the way she in particular was treated? And are they going to be looking into, I mean, should such a case ever happen again, the way they handle people who are being held, say, on a material witness warrant?
Yeah, so there was never any policy about witnesses, and that was the breakdown in this case. And it forced them to go back and say, okay, well, what is our policy? And when I was talking to Gourley, he said that it now puts things in the policy that witnesses not facing charges need to be respected and dignified. If they don't need restraints, then we will not be using them. And that's basically their starting point now. The starting point is we're not going to be using restraints, but then there's a risk assessment that is carried out on a case-by-case basis, and then it goes from there.
All right. Now, Jonny, you've been looking at a completely different angle on this case, which is the kind of support system that existed for this woman. I mean, this is a terribly tragic circumstance. She was 28 years old. She was Indigenous. She was homeless. She was an addict, and subsequently was killed in a completely unrelated incident to this after the preliminary inquiry testimony. But I was quite shocked reading Campbell's report to realize that she'd basically had no support. So what have you been looking at in the issue of how we provide services to victims?
Right, so I guess just to start, so what are victim services? They are basically, as the name would suggest, services that are provided to victims of crime, people who have experienced some sort of traumatic event. There are victim services workers in the city with a couple of organizations, including the police service, who are supposed to advocate for people who have been victims in some way, connect them with services like counseling, help them navigate the court system, seeking potential compensation for being a victim of a crime, doing things called crisis call-outs. So these were the things that are supposed to be done when someone is a victim of a traumatic crime and needs support.
And this woman, did she receive any of these?
In Campbell's report, she notes that the woman, she did not appear to be referred to the victim services offered by Edmonton Police, apparently had no contact with any victim service worker, essentially between her assault and the start of the preliminary inquiry. And she says it's difficult to imagine how that could have been.
Well, and it's shocking, too, because you'd think that for their own self-interest, the police and the Crown would want a witness to feel supported so that that witness would arrive in court properly prepared to testify. I mean, that's the thing that I found really, really odd about the whole timeline of this case, is that, you know, from what we learned in the court proceedings, the victim here only even found out that she was being called to testify sort of by accident. And so what did Campbell recommend for how we could improve victim services so that victims actually get the support they need?
So she had 5 recommendations. Really, 2 of them are not particularly controversial. The province has said that it is going to create specialized court workers to help vulnerable witnesses navigate this system, and basically, a lot of those people should be Indigenous, so they have those cultural competencies. Those are recommendations that the province was like, all right, we're working on that, we're going to implement those things. The other 2 they're still studying, which would really change kind of fundamentally how victim services work, at least based on what people I have talked to about this have said. One is they would basically create a victim services system that is arm's length from the police. So as it stands, most of the victim services workers in Edmonton are volunteers with the police service. There's a victim services unit, and the RCMP have a similar system as well. And then the Bissell Center has, I believe, 2 actual workers. They're paid employees who work specifically in with vulnerable communities.
I mean, this is something that really astonished me, and I don't want to take anything away from the volunteers who've been doing, near as I can tell, terrific work. But why on earth would we have a system like this that's so important to the integrity of the court system and staff it with volunteers who aren't paid? It just seems to me it's like a model from the 1950s, not from 2018.
I've done some writing about this. There were some concerns. Police wanted to move these services out of their neighborhood police stations and into a single police station in kind of northwest Edmonton. And this made a lot of victim services workers unhappy. They actually, one went to the police commission and said this is going to cause these volunteers who you're not paying, who now have to commute all this distance and like volunteering in their neighborhoods, they're going to step away. You're going to lose a lot of experienced people. So
and has that happened?
Well, when Campbell wrote her report, there were apparently 112 victim services volunteers. And now when I asked the police service about this, there are apparently 66. So
that would suggest, yes, about a 40% drop-off.
Yeah, whether or not that was actually a factor in this case is a whole other thing. I mean, it's a system that is clearly going through pretty big changes as it stands. But what the province wants to do is to take this out of the hands of the police service, because marginalized groups, in some cases don't feel comfortable going to the police. They don't feel safe. They think they'll be re-victimized. So if they had basically a system like in Manitoba and some of the Atlantic provinces, is that these services are under the Justice Ministry, essentially. So they're not police. And Campbell recommends as well that these be full-time workers. So that is something that would come with a pretty significant price tag if we're creating a whole new class of employees that you have to pay to do these services, which largely, since 1979, actually, when the Victim Services Unit was created with the Edmonton Police, has been something that's been done by volunteers.
Well, and as I will discuss in my column that's part of this package of stories too, there's actually a significant surplus in the province's Victim Services Fund, money that they have been, I don't want to say hoarding. Hoarding is a judgmental word, but let's just say that they have been holding in reserve. And in my column, I asked some questions that come from the Auditor General's report from a couple of years ago into what exactly the province is doing with all of that money, and whether there's a better way to invest some of that money in giving people the frontline services and supports they need.
And as you said, it is really remarkable that for so long these services have been provided, albeit not terribly well in the case we're discussing, but they've been provided by volunteers. So, I talked to one victim services volunteer for another story who was talking about how meaningful this work was to her, but at the same time, there weren't, this is heavy stuff. You might just be driving down the highway sometime and you start crying and you don't understand why. And
yeah, I can imagine.
So
You'd suffer from post-traumatic stress even as a victim counselor if you didn't have the training and support systems yourself to take on the weight of all of that tragedy and all of that pain.
I don't think anyone would find particularly surprising that that's how some people would react to all that.
Well, it's I think really telling that this report, which was started off looking at a very particular case, the actions of one Crown prosecutor, one judge, the consequences for one victim, has ended up opening a really important discussion about everything from the way people sit or stand in a courtroom to testify, to the way that they're transported back and forth, to the way that they're counseled between the time of the incident and the time of the trial. So I want to thank you both for joining us. I want to apologize for Paige Parsons, who was going to be here but is in court covering yet another case. And I want to thank Sean Butts, our videographer, who has filmed this for us. This is kind of an experiment. So we'll be very interested to know what you think about the package of stories, what you think about this video format. Please get in touch and let us know. We'd love to hear your comments. So thank you, Jonny, and thank you, Juris, and thank you all for watching and listening.
Thank you.
Thanks.